Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we aim to inspire you to go and make disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimas.
And I'm Brian Rombacher, and this is a television outreach of Reasons to Believe, a viewer-supported ministry where science and faith converge.
And as you're watching the show, if you want to support resources like 2819, visit reasons.org/2819.
And if you happen to be watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button below. We want you to stay up to date on all the new videos Reasons to Believe is producing.
And also, don't forget, connect with us on social media. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show.
And once again, a shout out to all of our podcast listeners. Thank you so much for being part of the show. You only get to hear what's going on, so you don't get to see when I eat pie and cake or we do other fun things. So thanks for sticking in there. And if you want to listen to the podcast version, it's on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and we are now on Spotify. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast, and you can find us there.
Well, I think it's about time for a rundown, right?
Let's do it.
In our Nexus segment, we're going to hear a Reasons Forum clip from Anjeanette Roberts, and she's talking about trusting God in the midst of pain.
In RTB 101, Crystal will be interviewing astronomer Hugh Ross, asking the question, was there rain before the flood?
Then in our Give and Take segment, Dr. Fazale Rana will join Jeff Zweerink, and they'll discuss the question, what to do with the Endosymbiont hypothesis.
And I need to watch that segment because I don't even know what that means.
Right?
Okay. First up, we have Culture Talk. Sandra's going to be talking with visiting scholar, philosopher, and theologian Kenny Rhodes, and they're going to be talking about, does music point to the existence of God? And I hope so. So let's check it out.
Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of science, faith, and pop culture, and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with Kenny Rhodes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So you are a philosopher, theologian, and you're also an RTB visiting scholar.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And you know what? You're a musician, rumor has it.
Yeah, I'm a musician too. Yeah.
So that's actually what we're going to dive into because you and I both love music for different reasons. You're a musician, I'm a dancer. And we feel like this is a great tool to talk with people about really how God exists. So how would you even dive into that question of using music to point to the existence of God?
You know, music has been impacting my life ever since my dad used to say I was knee-high to a grasshopper or something like that, one of those old Southern sayings. Mm-hmm. But one of my earliest memories was standing at the record console. And back in those days, they were just big pieces of furniture. Yep. And just literally teething on the rim of the record player and chewing on that and looking down at the record spin on the turntable and listening to the music. And I can tell you what band it was. It was Creedence Clearwater Revival, the record company. It's just burned in my memory. And from that very early age, music has had a big part of my life, and it's touched me in profound ways.
And so it's helped you to see that a creator exists, right?
Yeah, well, it's something that cues us in on there's a transcendent reality that we all know. We can't put our finger on it, but it's there, and all of us get that sense of it when you play a beautiful melody. I remember just talking to my daughter just a few days ago. An old song came on, I think it, one of the Backstreet Boys or, one of those that I'm embarrassed to even say, hey, but it was a melody that caught me, and it immediately brought me to tears because it moved my heart in such a way. And as a Christian, I perceive God in everything, and so I look for God in everything. Right. And so in that beautiful melody, my heart was drawn to worship.
Right. And that is such a common thing for Christians who love music, is that music helps move us to worship. And that's why we have music in our church services, because it draws us to worship. But for any other religion or people who aren't of the Christian faith, they can say that's anything. But what specifically about music and rhythm and kind of the mathematics of music, what points us to the God of the Bible?
Well, I would have to go right back to that idea of transcendence. Dr. Ross is always talking about the Big Bang and the beginning of the universe and the necessity that universe was brought into existence by what the scientists say, a transcendent causal agent. Mm-hmm. I call him my Lord Jesus Christ and my Father. Yeah. But that's what science has called this one who's brought everything into existence. And so God must transcend the parameters of the universe and time and space. And I think music keys us in on that reality. There is something else there. And it's not just emotions. I've played in bands before, and it didn't matter what kind of music, Christian or instrumental. When you play in a band and there's this deep connection that's there, and this intercommunication with music and playing off one another, you can't even put it into words because you just know this is an emotion. Mm-hmm. This isn't anything but a higher level of a reality that I have just tapped into. And that's why I think it just points to God and as that transcendent creator, which no other religion has God as the transcendent creator.
Well, you talked about words and that you can't even put it into words. And there's, for people who love music, we know like a common saying is when words fail, music speaks.
Okay.
And it's something that for those who love music, there is an emotional response to music.
Yeah.
And for that, when you know someone who just is so moved by music, how do you use that to point to that transcendent God and to point to a hope and a joy and an excitement that is beyond this earth?
I just think that music is fundamentally the expression of the human soul. Mm. It's much more than just the brain and the rationality and the intellect of the human being. And it's not just emotion. There is really something there, and I just believe it's the mind, soul, spirit of the human being that is really being touched by music. And Mikio Kaku, who's a physicist, he speaks about string theory, and Dr. Ross talks about string theory. But at the end of it, he talks about the fact that at the very core, the fundamental reality is a string, a vibration, a note that springs forth the elementary particles. And I like that for the kind of aesthetic reasons. And Mikio Kaku talks about the fact that the creator is a musician. Mm-hmm. And I love that concept because I feel like I'm worshiping and being who I am as a musician, and I'm just reflecting his beauty. I'm partaking in what is beautiful, which is he is, and I'm in participation with that beauty. And I think that's why it appeals to all humans. It's a part of God that is goodness, beauty, which is a technical argument for God. Mm-hmm. And we just sense it. And music is beautiful. Scenery, art, poetry is beautiful to us because it's participating in the one who is good, who is beautiful. Yeah. And all humans kind of sense that.
Right. And you're touching on a lot of different topics. Something to point out is that this argument of using music as an apologetic, it isn't something that we just conjured up. Like there are...
I mean, I make a lot of stuff up.
Right.
You know, but I didn't make that one up.
Yeah, it's a legitimate apologetic argument from aesthetics, from beauty. And really what it does is it points to us as being created in the image of God. Our God is creator. He is artist.
Yes.
And he has granted us that image. And likewise, then we can create, and we are reflecting God's image when we do that, when we engage in art.
Right. I think it's really a part of what Ken Sample says, the Imago Dei.
Right.
And because we're made in God's image, we are little creators, and we participate. Even philosophers have talked about the fact that, when we think and we're rational, we're simply just partaking of the divine mind. Mm-hmm. And in anything that we do, one of my favorite verses, and I have a lot of favorite verses, and it depends on what day you catch me, my favorite verse might change, but one of them is, in him we live and move and have our being. In God, everything is summed up about reality.
Thank you so much for that, Kenny. If you want to hear more on the image of God, visit reasons.org and search Image of God. Now we're going to go to a Nexus segment. We're going to see a clip from our Reasons Forum where Dr. Anjeanette Roberts addresses the topic of trusting God in the midst of pain. Let's check it out.
This is perhaps the second most controversial thing I will say, but hopefully I have at least begun to hint that this could quite possibly be true, and I believe it is very true, that there is no evil, even if we're talking about moral evil, that is so great that the power of God to redeem it is not even greater. No matter how great our suffering or pain, God is able to meet us in the midst of it and to hold us fast. All we have to do is cry out to him. He has suffered as one of us. He's known, Jesus, as a man of sorrows, and he still enters into our suffering today. His presence and the presence of his children or his other followers with us lightens our burdens. And it's our response to such events, whether external or internal, that have eternal significance. They are part of what I think is the glory of the Creator exemplified in those who proclaim the greatest love story ever told. And I believe that through these processes, God is fitting us for eternity with him. I think that's what the soul formation is. He's fitting us for eternity with him and with one another. That's the greater good that he wants to work through us in these momentary light afflictions. Every adversity we face is an invitation to turn toward God or to turn away. And hope is found only when we turn toward him. And in doing so, we're learning of God's trustworthiness and love. So I think it's a rush to judgment, and we grossly misunderstand if we understand that things we superficially judge as evil or bad, if we don't see them as perhaps extremely good, and as the means for our maturity and our learning the depth of God's goodness, love, mercy, trustworthiness, and faithfulness. If we see these as invitations to live in Christian community, comforting one another and bearing hope to one another, and compassion to those in need, and if we see them as invitations to remember God's promises, that his presence and his provision is there for us in Jesus, and that these things are temporary and will fade in eternity when they've accomplished their purpose in this life, in this creation. This is an invitation to deep belief revision. And if I've accomplished any of these things, then perhaps it's been a successful endeavor. Hopefully, we can see how greater knowledge of nature can actually help us change our perspective to see God's goodness and power where we once rushed to judge superficially bad or evil those things in nature like earthquakes, bacteria, and viruses. And as we disassemble a view of natural evil, we see that God's revelation in creation reinforces a Christian view of God as rich in love and in provision, and that his heart to us is abundantly good. And now, hopefully, we can see, at least begin to think, of how suffering and adversity can be an invitation to exercise and grow human virtue and a veil of soul-making. We know evil and adversity will not last forever, and we know we're not called or meant to face it alone. So let us comfort one another as we've received comfort, and let us turn one another's attention to God's presence and God's promise to ultimately deliver us from evil and suffering. I think a Christian worldview provides robust, although not quick or simple answers to some critics' quips as to how God could allow such evil in nature and how God could allow so much human suffering and pain. And I think we can say with greater confidence, even after this brief reflection, that God is great and God is good.
Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help train you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. And here to help me talk about a very common question today is astronomer Dr. Hugh Ross. Welcome back, Hugh.
Thank you.
Believe it or not, I was on a walk just 2 days ago with my best friend, and we got into a conversation, and this question came up, and that is, was there rain before Noah's flood? And my friend was absolutely convinced that the Bible teaches there was no rain before the flood. That would mean that there's no rainbows before the flood either. First of all, let's start with, where does this idea come from? Is there a verse in Scripture that might give us this idea?
Well, it's this idea that rain didn't happen until the flood of Noah.
Right.
That was the first time we get rain. And when we go to Genesis 2, though, it talks about how God watered the garden with a mist. If you actually look at the original Hebrew, they got two words for liquid precipitation, ed and matar. One means relatively large drops of water falling from the sky, what we would call rain. The other is what we would call mist, tiny drops of water. But guess what? You get a rainbow with both. If you've got a fog or a mist or just tiny drops of water, you'll get a rainbow just as effectively as you will if you got big drops of water coming from the sky.
So when it says in Genesis 2:5, and it says, "For the Lord had not yet sent rain on the earth," how do we interpret that? The straightforward interpretation of that certainly makes it sound like there was no rain at that point.
Well, you read beyond that, then it talks about God sending this mist into the garden. And again, the context is the Garden of Eden. It's not necessarily saying that this applied to the entire planet. It's focusing on the earth of the Garden of Eden. And I believe that the location of the Garden of Eden is probably somewhere in the southeastern portion of what is now the Persian Gulf. That's a place where you don't get rain like you do in coastal British Columbia. But you do get fog, you do get mist. And it also talks about water coming up from below, the underground aquifers.
Right.
That's all there in the text. But my point is you're going to get rainbows either way. Moreover, there's another biblical principle, which you see in Genesis chapter 9. God tells Noah, when you see the rainbow, this will be a sign of the covenant agreement between the two of us. And what you notice in all the rest of the covenant agreements that God makes with humanity, he always appeals to something known in the natural realm to sign the covenant agreement, which would imply that Noah must have been familiar with the rainbows before the flood, not just after the flood.
That's a really good point because, like, for example, in the covenant he makes with the people of Israel under Moses, he chooses a lamb.
Right.
It wasn't that lambs came into existence for the first time after the Exodus event.
Likewise with communion,
Yeah.
water and wine.
Or the
Those
bread
are things,
and the wine,
Yeah,
yeah.
the bread and the wine, sorry.
Yeah. I'm remembering back to my elementary school science and the water cycle. And really rain is, if I think about it, it's really just part of how the earth has been set up, and rainbows are just physics. It's just bent light. So to argue that there was no rain before the flood or no rainbows, you're almost making an argument that physics was different before the flood. Would that be accurate?
That would be accurate if you don't recognize that, Ed and Matar referring to two different kinds of liquid precipitation.
Okay.
Another good biblical text to go is Job 37 and Job 38, because there it speaks in detail about the water cycle that God set up for the earth and mentions in terms of the liquid precipitation, it's going to be rain and mist and fog.
Okay.
So it's basically making a point there are different kinds of liquid precipitation, just like there are different kinds of frozen precipitation, the snow and the frost and the hail.
So we shouldn't be thrown off by Genesis 2:5, where it says there was no shrub yet appeared on the earth, no plants, and God had not yet sent rain. What you're arguing is that might not be the earth as in planet Earth. It could have been that land, which is the same word in Hebrew. It can mean the whole planet or it can mean a piece of land.
And notice in Genesis 1, you don't get the water cycle until creation day 2. So when it says there was no rain, it's actually taking it back to creation day 1.
Okay.
And so it's simply recognizing that's a summary and it's a non-chronological summary.
Okay.
And so don't look at the rain as necessarily coming before or after the other items mentioned in the verse.
So to wrap up this conversation, if I as a Christian were to try to tell a non-Christian, if I'm sharing my faith and I try to suggest that there was no rain before the flood, like how is that going to come across to a non-Christian in a witnessing context?
Well,
is that a good strategy?
No, it's not, because
Okay.
you might be talking to a non-Christian who actually has a significant science background, and they're going to know enough about the physics and the chemistry of the earth to realize that's not the case, that there's been rain falling for a very long time. We can actually see fossilized raindrops that date back more than 2 billion years. So that tells us that rain's been falling throughout the whole history, or at least most of the history of the earth. So yeah, I wouldn't advise that, but what I would say to the Christian, before you make that kind of an argument, look at everything the Bible says about the issue.
Okay.
Don't just look at Genesis 2:5.
Don't just look at one verse.
Yeah, look at all of Genesis 1. Get the context of what Genesis 2:5 is doing, and you want to look at the other creation texts in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, etc.
Thank you, Hugh. And I do want to invite you to go check out Hugh's blog. Visit our website at reasons.org and search for today's New Reason to Believe.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look into important scientific ideas and see how they correspond with the truth of Christianity. Today, we're joined again by Fazale Rana, and we're going to address a perceived challenge to the Christian faith called the Endosymbiont hypothesis. Fuzz, nice to have you in studio again.
Jeff?
So this is probably a term that most people are not familiar with, but I know you get this question a lot as you talk about science-faith issues. And so let's just kind of break it out. What is the endosymbiont hypothesis, and why, as a Christian, should we care about it?
Yeah, well, this is actually considered to be one of the most important ideas in evolutionary biology, and it's a model that's designed to explain the origin of what are called eukaryotic cells or complex cells. So in nature, there are two different cell types. The types of cells that are represented by bacteria, which are small cells that have a cell wall but no kind of internal structures whatsoever. And then there's the cells that people would probably be familiar with from a biology textbook, with a nucleus and organelles and all these internal membrane systems.
Going to have the Golgi apparatus in there, those sort. So the common cell that we're thinking about. Okay.
And so the question is, how do these types of cells appear? How do they evolve? And so the endosymbiont hypothesis is designed to explain the origin of what are called eukaryotic cells or complex cells.
And so presumably the challenge is you go from this relatively simple structure to one where there's this lot of internal structure. Right. How do you get that? So what does the endosymbiont hypothesis say accounts for that?
Yeah, well, this is an idea who was advocated for by a scientist by the name of Lynn Margulis. And she had this idea that you'd have a mother cell, a mother bacterial cell, that would have engulfed other cells. And those cells that become engulfed would establish a permanent symbiotic relationship where those cells would reside in the interior of this larger cell. And over time, that endosymbiotic relationship would become so integrated that the endosymbiont would give up some of its genes. It would lose parts of its genome and become, in a sense, enslaved to the mother cell. And yet the mother cell would create an environment where this organelle now could thrive. It could live. And so the endosymbiont would provide usually ATP compounds that are used to drive cellular processes for the mother cell, and the mother cell again would provide nutrients for this endosymbiont. And so again, over time, the idea is that this would morph into these complex cells.
So the basic idea, as I understand it, is you've got a whole bunch of cells there. One gets engulfed in another for whatever reason, and in the process of doing that, the environment of being protected means what's inside no longer has to do that. It'll lose some functions, but it will be supplying resources and materials to the mother cell. So you end up developing this community, presumably the nucleus, the mitochondria, that sort of stuff would all have been developed in that sort of fashion.
Right.
So fits very well in an evolutionary scenario. I could see that. Is there any good evidence for that?
Well, I mean, the evidence for it would be basically the similarity between organelles and bacteria. So the quintessential example is the mitochondria, which is this bean-shaped structure in cells that is like the powerhouse of the cell. It produces the energy that the cell needs to operate, and it has some superficial similarities to certain types of bacteria. And so people argue, well, this is evidence for endosymbiosis or the endosymbiont hypothesis.
Well, and this has the mitochondria has the DNA in it, so that's part of what gives a little bit of credence to that.
Yeah,
idea.
It has a small circular piece of DNA that people believe are the remnants of that cell's genome that was then lost through this process of what's called genome reduction.
So you've written an article about this where humans have been able to go do this endosymbiosis in the lab. Kind of flesh out the details. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, the idea is to try to understand in specific detail how this process happened. And so people used a yeast cell, that was representative of the mother cell, and they created a yeast cell that was deficient in the production of ATP. Its mitochondria weren't working really well.
So ATP is kind of like a power molecule, if you will.
You could think of it like as the gasoline for the cell.
All right.
And so what they then did is they took a bacterium, E. coli, and they engineered it so that the E. coli could not produce a certain compound needed for its survival.
Okay.
And so it would have to rely on the yeast cell for that compound, whereas the yeast would have to rely on the E. coli for its ATP production. And so they ended up going through a fairly elaborate process of genetic engineering to get the yeast cell to live in the mitochondria. And it not only included having the E. coli, dependent upon the yeast for this essential nutrient, but they also had to engineer what was called an ATP transporter that would take ATP from the center of the E. coli and dump it into the yeast cell so that the yeast cell could use that. So they actually had to find that from an organism that was already an endosymbiont in order to do that. And then they had to figure out how to get the E. coli to survive in the yeast cell, because the yeast cell would basically break it down, treating it like a foreign material. And so they actually had to take 3 or 4 genes from different bacteria and assemble them in such a way that to protect the E. coli from these breakdown pathways that existed inside the yeast cell.
So it wasn't just sufficient to knock out part of what the yeast cell needed, or engineer this to produce that. Putting it together didn't work. It seemed like you're describing a number of other steps that they had to put in place in order for it to work.
And this is just to get what people believe to be the very, very first step in the process of endosymbiogenesis. There's so many other steps that are needed for that to happen. This is just the very first step. And so what you see is it takes an enormous amount of ingenuity on the part of the researchers to even establish that endosymbiotic relationship.
That is just fascinating. That it's not that we can't figure out how this might have happened, but it seems to me reasonable that maybe some sort of endosymbiosis did happen. But it seems like it's very engineered to do it, that it points towards a mind behind it, not just random processes, if you will.
And so this to me is the dilemma, or the irony, is that in the attempt to try to understand how endosymbiogenesis would have happened in an evolutionary framework, these researchers actually showed intelligent agency is critical to get that first step established. So ironically, they're providing evidence for design or for creation as the explanation for the origin of eukaryotic cells, not evolution.
Fascinating comments. Thank you, Fuzz. The endosymbiont hypothesis for a long time has been a fairly prominent challenge to a creationist way of looking at life, because it seems to support the evolutionary ideas. But as we're exploring that and trying to understand it more deeply, ironically, it actually points towards a creator, a well-designed system that has a mind behind it. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and look for Fuzz's blog on this topic. Search for Endosymbiont Hypothesis, and the title of the article is Endosymbiont Hypothesis and the Ironic Case for a Creator. And as you read through that and understand that, you will be well equipped to respond to this challenge that you're likely to face if you point towards and advocate for a creation worldview.
That does it for us this week on 2819.
We hope that you've been encouraged through this episode to go out and share your faith, and to do so with confidence and compassion.
And if you want to support resources like this show, please visit reasons.org/2819.
And don't forget, we're bored. We really want to hear from you, so find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show.
Looking forward to all those comments and likes. See you next time.